Okay, everyone, welcome back for this session. This is presented by Ascendis Pharma, and we have Dr. Amy Hsu giving the presentation today. It's all yours.
Great. Let me move my webcam. Hi, everyone. Nice to be with you. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. Did that work okay?
Okay, folks.
Yes, yeah, it looks good.
Folks can hear me? Okay, great. Well, thank you for inviting us again. It's nice to be with you for the second International Hypoparathyroidism Conference. Today, we're going to focus, I asked around to hear what you might be interested in hearing, and we settled on drug development with patients at the center. So by way of introduction, I oversee the clinical trials and the clinical program as we study TransCon PTH, and I'm part of a very big team of many who are also listening in today and many who may not be listening but have contributed to this work. So the outline for how we're going to discuss things in the next 45 minutes or so will be that I will introduce you to Ascendis Pharma. Some of you know us, some of you not yet. The technology and the pipeline. We'll talk a little bit about FDA's patient-focused drug development initiative. And then I wanted to highlight two projects where the Hypoparathyroidism Association has taught our company a lot about what it's like to live with hypoparathyroidism and has helped us develop a scale or a measurement or a tool. There's many different ways to call this, called HPES, the Hypoparathyroidism Patient Experience Scales, that we have carried forward into clinical trials and can be a really nice measurement tool for standardizing language and about symptoms and burden of symptoms. And through this story, I hope to be able to share with you a little flavor of what it takes to develop drugs. It takes time and it takes a big team. And it takes dedicated patients like you, so thank you. By way of introduction to Ascendis Pharma, here are our mission, vision, and values. Our mission is to develop best-in-class therapeutics addressing unmet medical needs. And we'd like to build, and we are building, a fully integrated biopharma company that makes meaningful improvement in patients' lives. And I'll share with you some of the things that we're studying now. And then our values include patience, as you see, it's right there at the top, science, and passion. And this governs everything that we do here. I shared this similar slide last year as well too. This is where Ascendis Pharma and our partners are located across the globe. Our headquarters are in Denmark, near Copenhagen. That's represented there in the blue here. We also have research and clinical sites in Germany. And then we have an office where I'm calling from today in California, Northern California. And we also have an office that's not yet represented here in New Jersey. We have a partnership with a group in China also called Vision Pharmaceuticals. This is what's the core behind what we're doing. It's what we call our technology platform. And you may have heard, or I'm going to tell you about our parathyroid hormone investigational therapeutic called TransCon PTH. And the word TransCon comes from transient conjugation, you see there at the top, meaning temporarily attached or attached for a short time. And it's a powerful and flexible platform, a mix and match in some ways. What we do is we choose drugs. You see here at the very bottom, the third row. They can be proteins, they can be peptides, they can be small molecules. So in other words, they can be big or little, but usually endocrine hormones lend themselves nicely to this because they have relatively short half-lives. And what our technology platform does is it's able to prolong the half-life so that although the hormone can be made naturally in the body, for instance, in parathyroid hormone has a half-life of 3 minutes, so that you don't have to take a shot. If you need to rely on an external shot, you don't need to take a shot very many times a day. And in this case, we're making a drug that could be taken once a day with the TransCon PTH. At the top row, you see what we call a linker, and that links the drug to what's in the middle row, the carrier. On the left side here, you see soluble carriers. Those are carriers that can carry the hormone across the body through the bloodstream. And then we also have insoluble carriers, ones that don't float around in the bloodstream, but stay in the same place where they were injected or near the same space. And these are, for instance, what we call hydrogels, and it can release many molecules slowly over time of the drug. And so for the case of TransCon PTH, we're down here with the orange helical peptide. We're using a linker here at the top, the cyclic imide, and then a soluble carrier. And I'll show you a picture of that later. But before we get there, I'd like to show you and give you an update on all of our activities here at Ascendis Pharma. And going from left to right, we have things from product candidates, preclinical, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, those are the clinical phases, and then regulatory and approval. And regulatory signifies that our biggest audience, or one big audience, is the one, for instance, in the United States, that decides if we can do marketing or not, decides if a drug is safe and effective for patients to use. So that is one of the first audiences we have when we're making an investigational therapy. They determine if it can be approved for patients. So you see on the very top, we have TransCon growth hormone for children with growth hormone deficiency, and we're studying adults with growth hormone deficiency. I'm really happy to share with you that the TransCon growth hormone was recently approved for the treatment of children with growth hormone deficiency. It uses the same technology platform as we do for parathyroid hormone. And in fact, we have announced that the therapy is launching today. Then on the next row here, you see TransCon parathyroid hormone, and we are studying the treatment of hypoparathyroidism, as some of you know already. We also have TransCon C natural peptide for the treatment of achondroplasia, the most common cause of dwarfism. And so these are all in various stages, proceeding through towards a regulatory audience. Also here represented in green, we have an oncology program and are studying in the early phases of studying therapies for cancers. So a lot of exciting activity. And here I show you what TransCon PTH looks like in a cartoon form. On the left-hand side, there's PTH, that orange helix, linked with the linker to this flexible carrier that circulates in the bloodstream. When it's bound this way on the left-hand side, it's inactive. It's shielded by these blue arms of the carrier. They're not really blue, but they're blue here for illustrative purposes. And they circulate, in this case, for many hours of the day. Once it is injected into the body and sees, a body's temperature and pH, it slowly releases in a very controlled fashion active parathyroid hormone, so that the active parathyroid hormone can be released over 24 hours a day. This linker and carrier construct is excreted unchanged, mostly by the kidney. So in summary here, TransCon PTH is a sustained release prodrug designed to release stable PTH levels in the physiologic range, so in the normal range, for someone who makes PTH themselves for 24 hours a day. And it consists of that parent drug, PTH 1-34, which is temporarily bound to this carrier and linker. And under exposure, to body conditions, then we have the active PTH getting slowly released over time. And in this case, because it's dosed every day, and it has a relatively long half-life, we're able to keep parathyroid hormones in the normal range. That's how it was designed, and it was designed this way to be able to accomplish all of the things that we'd like a therapy to accomplish for patients with hypoparathyroidism. We'd like to be able to keep your serum electrolytes in the normal range, calcium and phosphate. We'd like to be able to manage urine calcium, reclaim that urine calcium the way parathyroid hormone should be doing. We'd like to normalize skeletal and bone health. We'd like to help you make you feel like the way you did, or would like to feel before you had hypoparathyroidism. So here is, we were really excited to see when we took TransCon parathyroid hormone into the first human beings. So these are healthy volunteers, a phase 1 study, and we injected, these patients injected the therapy every day for 10 days in a row. And what you see here is just on day 10, these 4 different colored lines are different doses of TransCon PTH. The PTH that was recovered from the blood was right there where you would expect it to be, in the bottom of the normal range. Now, I will mention here that the normal range expressed in picograms per ml is lower than what you might be used to seeing, which is something like 10 to 65 picograms per ml. But this accounts for the fact that this molecule is about a third or fourth, 40% of the size of parathyroid hormone 1 to 84. This is the business end of the parathyroid hormone, and this represents, this dotted line here represents what would be a normal range for PTH 1 to 34. So essentially what we have shown here in the first study in healthy patients is that with TransCon PTH daily dosing, we're able to get parathyroid hormone into the normal range in a flat infusion-like profile, which is very similar to how the body usually makes it during the day as well, if one's parathyroid hormone axis were intact. Okay, moving to the next piece, where we're going to start talking about how we at Ascendis do patients at the center with drug development. And I'd first like to discuss with you that FDA has a formal initiative here. So as mentioned, the Food and Drug Administration is the regulatory authority in the United States, which has the authority to review and evaluate drugs to be safe and effective. And if they deem them to be safe and effective, then they may be brought to patients, right? Sold to and brought to patients, made available to patients. So this process of making a new drug available involves many steps. And as you can imagine, many years as well too. And I've taken a snapshot from the website from FDA, and you see here it starts with discovery and development. So chemists reading and thinking about what might be interesting. Then you take it into animals, first tested a little bit in animals and cells. Then you take it to clinical research. And that's what the part where I work and where many of you have participated in some of these trials before. Then it goes on to FDA review, which can take quite a bit of time, sometimes a year or longer. And then if FDA gives it the green light, then the drug becomes available for patients. And even after that, the scrutiny on safety doesn't stop. Oftentimes, there's a lot of attention in different ways to continue monitoring if a new drug continues to be safe in the real world setting. So we like to say drug development is really a team sport and includes chemists, toxicologists, drug disposition scientists. So how does the drug get out of the body? Not only how does it get in, but how does it get out? Clinicians like healthcare providers, and regulatory scientists who specialize in negotiating with regulatory bodies like the FDA. I will also mention that there are regulatory bodies in every country around the world, right? And sometimes they work together. For instance, in Europe, there's the European Medical Authority. And in Japan and China, there are separate ones there too. So recently, as recently as June 2020, FDA came out with one of its first guidances on patient-focused drug development. So I'm happy to say they've been listening to patients, your congressmen and senators have been listening to patients, and FDA has committed to issuing guidance to support the patient voice in drug development. And this means, giving guidance on how to collect meaningful patient input from a variety of settings, and that includes clinical trials, public meetings, online patient communities. I think many of these fora are ones that you're familiar with. And the objective is thus to better inform drug development and regulatory decision-making. This is, after all, why one would make a drug, right? Is to serve and to make somebody feel better. And so, of course, the patient voice should be very important, and we think at the center. So this is the data that we're collecting, could be broadly called patient experience data, and it can be things such as, what's the impact of your condition? What's the impact of taking the therapy that you take? And what kind of preferences for treatment do you have? So now we'll move on to two projects which this association has been really key to supporting and helping. And I wanted to share with you some of the background legwork that happened on your side, our side, and the results, and to show you how far we've come. Although there is, of course, still more work to be done. So the Voices of Hypopara survey, you may have heard about it. The results are on your website. And I know it was discussed last year. Dr. Kohlmeyer spoke about it. It was an online survey hosted by the Hypopara Association and supported by Ascendis Pharma, distributed to the membership of Hypopara Association, and it was voluntary and anonymous. The objective was to gather information about the experiences of patients living with hypoparathyroidism to support disease education and awareness. And these completed responses were collected last year in the spring between April 30th and May 8th, 2020, and then subsequently analyzed. So thank you. So it was distributed to about 1,000 of you. It was 58 questions, and thank you to the 146 of you who completed it. It was distributed to US members, and on the website you do see a really nice fact sheet here, and the front part of the fact sheet shows how many of you from across the United States participated. And here on the left-hand side, there are a lot of good information that came out of here. But on the left-hand side, we're showing you here a symptom cloud, for instance, where the biggest text are the things that people mentioned the most. And I can let you know that at least at my place of employment, Ascendis Pharma, this was especially helpful to having all of us, the team sport, right? All my team members understand what it is you're looking, what it is your life looks like, what it is that concerns you, what it is like to try to seek care, right? And some have been closer to patients in their past and some less close. And it was extremely helpful for a company that is trying to bring something helpful for the care of hypoparathyroidism. So thank you. Now we'll move on to another project that we've been working on with some of you, and that was the development of the hypoparathyroidism patient experience scales. It's a mouthful, so we've abbreviated it as HPES, and we work with a consultant outside of the company also on this, and she's an expert in developing patient reported outcomes and these special instruments for assessing what it is that patient feels, symptoms, and impacts. So what is the HPES? As I mentioned, it's an instrument for measuring what we call patient-reported outcomes. And patient-reported outcomes is another FDA term. And sure enough, they have a guidance about this too that was made in, first published in December 2009. And it's a report literally of the patient's health condition, and it has to come directly from the patient. There are many other types of patient experience data that may come from loved ones, caregivers, physicians, but in this case, a PRO or a patient-reported outcome can only come from one person, and that is the patient at the very center, right? And it can come in many forms, but most commonly it might be a questionnaire to measure treatment benefit. How do you feel without a certain treatment, and then how do you feel with a certain treatment on board? And this figure down here is a figure from the guidance from FDA. And I'm not trying to show all the little words necessarily that's in here, but I highlighted this circle and the fact that it's an iterative process, meaning It can take a long time to try to get exactly the core and not so core questions that really crystallize what it means to live with hypoparathyroidism and what could we improve, what should we be improving with the therapy. So it's first to think about what a questionnaire might look like, interview patients, keep adjusting it, asking them again, going back to the patient, say, does this help, right? And trying it out in trials and seeing, does it distinguish those who are getting better from those who doesn't? Does it distinguish those who are on an effective treatment versus not, right? So you might go around this circle many times over many years to figure out the ideal instrument that could distinguish improvement versus non-improvement. So the rationale for developing an HPES or HPES scales, because there are two, are the following. Patient-reported outcomes are not new, but many of them that we have that are tried and true are generic. They're not specific to hypoparathyroidism, and frankly, some of the symptoms may not be represented in a generic instrument. For instance, muscle fatigue or brain fog. So it is generally thought that for sometimes conditions where there is a significant burden of illness, burden of symptoms, that it is more helpful to have a disease-specific instrument, or maybe not more helpful, but at least it broadens the understanding, right? At least it's a companion piece of information. And so we sought to develop a disease-specific instrument to use in our clinical trials to show if TransCon PTH would improve symptoms, reduce symptoms, and improve quality of life. We wanted to include disease impact as well. So impact is something going just beyond symptoms. Symptoms are what you feel, muscle cramps, tiredness, brain fog. Impact could be, well, not as happy or can't do exercise. So we wanted to also look even a little bit deeper. What does it mean to have these symptoms every week or every day? Having such a scale as this also helps standardize the language, the lexicon that we can use with each other, with prescribers, and with our insurance companies, right? To describe the severity and the breadth of the clinical syndrome. And we can also then, therefore, potentially better assess symptoms from a patient perspective. So here's what it took, only part of what it took, and we're still developing the HPES symptom and impact scale. So it's still in that iterative process that I showed you. But here's what we've done so far, and this is thanks to help from this association. First, one tends to review the published literature. What's out there? If there's already a good scale that we could use from another disease state, or somebody already made a hypoparathyroidism disease scale that has, that it distinguishes symptoms well, we can potentially use that. If there isn't one, then you move along and try to think what would be the good questions to ask. So the initial part for what was done here was there were interviews of 5 clinical experts, and these were open-ended questions. Tell us about what you think, what you hear from your hypoparathyroidism patients. What kind of symptoms do we have? How does it impact their life? And I'm going to show you what they said, what they proactively came up with. Then we moved on to patients, and this is called qualitative concept elicitation. Very fancy way of saying that we talked to 42 members of the Hypoparathyroidism Association and had these individual one-on-one interviews, and you all know better than some of us. Some of them took an hour or more the first time, and they were semi-structured interviews, again, asking you how does this condition and the therapy affect the way your life is and the way you're able to move through your life. Then the team comes back using sophisticated software and analysis, just elbow grease analysis, to look at what was said, what were the common threads said among the 42 patients and the 5 clinical experts, the physicians, and try to boil it down to some questions that they could ask, right? And for instance, there might be 20, 25 questions they could ask that relate to symptoms. Then one would take it again, to another set of patients, an independent set of patients, not the first 42 that you asked, but the 16 new ones in this case, again, recruited through the Hypoparathyroidism Association, and asked them, do you think, how do these work? Would this distinguish a good day or a bad day for you? And through this process, ultimately, which took several months, it resulted in a 17-item HPES symptom scale and I think it was a 29-item impact scale. And I'll show you what those are. Later, we established content validity and also validate psychometric properties. Some of this entails bringing it into clinical trials and actually seeing how it performs in a clinical trial when some people know they're on treatment, some people, or nobody knows they're on treatment or not. So it's on placebo versus on treatment and seeing how it goes. So here's a cartoon of what types of things made it into the symptom and impact scale. So the symptoms, again, just very basic. What do you feel? So muscle cramping, muscle spasms, having trouble remembering, finding the right words, concentrating, thinking clearly. So these blue ones here were called physical, fell in the physical domain. And then these orange ones fell into a cognitive domain, all wrapped up as parts of the HPES symptom scale. So various questions, and it wouldn't necessarily be so obvious as to say, do you get muscle cramping or do you get muscle spasm? But something to elicit what kinds of symptoms do you get that might have to do with muscles, for instance. And then on the right-hand side, these are the HPES impact common threads that were identified through the interviews. So impacts on physical functioning, on daily life, on psychological well-being, social life and relationships. And I'll read to you some of them, right? For daily life, for instance, it's tasks around the home, hobbies and leisure activities. Do you have to plan your day around your symptoms? Psychological well-being, are there symptoms or feelings of anxiety and frustration, low self-confidence? And then types of common threads that were seen with social life and relationships, the activities one might do with other people. How have relationships changed with friends, families, and spouses? This is repeating what I just showed from before, the domains for symptom and impact. And now I'd like to share with you, and this is from published, a set of published papers about the process of developing the HPES scales. What patients reported, again, in an open-ended way, when the interviewer said, tell me about what life is like, what they reported, what you reported, patients reported, and then I'll show you what the clinical experts reported. So for instance here, the most frequently reported signs and symptoms included, as no surprise to you, tingling, numbness, paresthesia, muscle cramping, fatigue, right? 88%, 86, 83%. Muscle weakness, heat intolerance, cardiovascular, now we're in the 30s and 40%, joint pain, about 19%. And then what did the physicians say? So the next column over would be what the group of 5 physicians said. What you can see is the numbers are pretty similar. They could also voluntarily answer the interviewer that I think the patients have tingling, muscle cramping, fatigue, right? The percentages mostly match up. The patients sometimes have a bit more to say. No clinician brought up heat intolerance, for instance, right? And half the clinicians, or 20% instead of 40%, brought up muscle fatigue, which is really interesting. Here's the most frequently reported cognitive signs and symptoms: brain fog, forgetfulness. This is what the patient said. Here's what the physician said. So once again here, reasonable concordance, can't think clearly, fuzzy thinking. Again, here the clinicians weren't able to come up with that on their own. I would say if we asked them outright, maybe they would say yes, but this is not something that bubbled to the surface on their own. So now we move on to the impacts, the most frequently reported impacts on physical functioning. Here, what the patients say: inability to exercise, impaired mobility, impaired ability to walk, less physically active than I want to be. And look at this. The clinicians, some of them, half of them, less than half of them, were able to report, think that the impact on patients are that they cannot exercise the way they would like to be, or just cannot exercise. But they potentially underappreciate or did not bring up, right, proactively some of the other things that the patients were able to explain. Fine motor skills, for instance. Not that many patients complain of it, but again, 0% of clinicians would have thought of it. Here are the psychological impacts from the patient and then again from the clinicians. And here you see there's actually relatively good concordance. How about impacts on daily life? I'm going to give you the double again. So again, really interesting. For instance, the patients say 36% brought up, I need to plan my day around my symptoms. But for instance, the clinicians didn't bring that up as something at the top of their mind. Interference with work and productivity, 43% of patients said that, brought that up proactively. 100% of physicians did. So again, just really interesting to see it through the different lenses of the groups. How about social life and relationships? So again, I'll show you the two columns. Look at this, very good concordance. The physicians and the patients think, relationships are affected by treatment and by the disease and treatment. But social withdrawal, potentially, the patients were reporting it more than, not potentially, they did report it more than the physicians did. Okay, so now I'd like to show you what we did find in the clinical program using the HPES so far. So briefly, I'll share with you that the TransCon PTH clinical program is ongoing, and that's right sort of the middle of drug development, and right before we send data to FDA. So we have an ongoing phase 2 trial called the Path Forward trial, and we have an ongoing phase 3 trial called the Pathway trial. Today, what I'll share with you is some of the patient experience data from the Path Forward trial up through week 58, so up through a year of therapy. I'm also happy to let you know that a manuscript with data up to week 26 was recently electronically published and soon to be published in paper form as well too. And I think you'll recognize some of your physicians here and some of the speakers at the Hypoparathyroidism Association conference. And it is available online. I think there's no barriers to being able to get it. So if you're interested, you can go and see what we've found in the first 26 weeks of the phase 2 trial. And we have data in there about serum calcium levels, serum phosphate levels, urine calcium levels, they were quite good, and also how some patient experience data. So let me move right into that. So this figure, and I'll take a little bit of time to orient you to this, is the week 58 data. And these are what we call radar plots or spider plots, mostly because it could look like a spider plot, or excuse me, spider web. On the left side, we have the HPES symptom scale, and you see here the domains we mentioned, cognitive, physical, and then just the wrap-up total score. And then the impact scale that included these 5 domains of daily life, physical functioning, psychological well-being, and social life and relationship. 48 subjects took part in this, and in this survey during the clinical trial. And what you want to see here is coverage of less area on this scale. So at baseline, the total symptom score was high, meaning I have a lot of symptoms, right? So nearing 40 in all these different domains. By 1 year into therapy, week 58, you see here the scores have come down much lower. So still there's some symptoms, right? But it's now maybe 8 or 9. Same thing for the impact. The spider web took a lot more area at baseline before being exposed to TransCon PTH. But after 58 weeks being in the trial and being exposed to TransCon PTH, we're really reporting a lot less impact on these domains of life. So to me, it's incredibly, incredibly promising, right? This disease-specific scale showed decreases in all the domains compared to baseline. And then I'll just show you this because I know it's small, but this is a direct clip from the manuscript I just showed you. It goes row by row the treated patients, and then the placebo patients. So you may know that in this phase 2 trial, or you may not, that initially patients were randomly assigned to either getting TransCon PTH of a random fixed dose or placebo. They didn't know which one they were on. Their doctors didn't know which one they were on. But they were on something for 4 weeks, just an investigational drug is what we call it. And those who were randomized to the TransCon PTH are represented in this column here on the left-hand side, and those initially randomized to placebo, which was just saline with some excipients in it, are on the right-hand column. And what you see here is that for the HPES symptom scale, again, looking at the area that the colors cover, at baseline, there were a lot of symptoms, but by week 4, for those who got TransCon PTH, they reported a lot less symptom burden. Whereas those who were randomized to the placebo, the two colors here, the gray triangle and the dark gray triangle and the light gray triangle, maybe got a little better, but not actually got worse, because the gray triangle is week 4, right? So the gray triangle got bigger, and they were not feeling as well at the end of 4 weeks. Impact was the same thing, right? The area shrunk, the dark gray area, which means after 4 weeks of treatment, they were less affected, felt less impact of the disease and its treatment, versus those on placebo. They're essentially superimposed, right? These areas, the light gray and the dark area, the dark gray. So no improvement and potentially a little bit of worsening. One could say potentially because they expected more being in a trial with a new drug, and we can only guess, but it's very similar to how they felt 4 weeks prior. And then here, everybody, after week 4, everybody got active therapy in an open label way. So everybody knew they were on TransCon PTH, and they were also allowed to adjust to what individually was the best dose to keep their calcium in the normal range. So what you can see is by week 26, right? Now I don't separate it between those who are on placebo and those who are not, because everybody's on therapy. This effect was sustained through week 26, that those on therapy, now everybody, feel better at week 26 than they did at week 0 baseline. I'll also just give you a small peek at what we had for a disease, a generic scale. It's a generic scale called the short form 36, SF36 for short. However, it is widely used, widely recognized and accepted as pretty good. So we also use this scale, and we do use this instrument to compare with the disease-specific one that I just spent some time explaining to you. And again, what's exciting about what we show here is that in the gray bars, we have baseline, how somebody felt. And in this case, we want to have higher scores. Scores sort of within these two dotted lines would imply the typical feeling of physical and mental health in the US population, right? So between these two dotted lines. So at baseline, what you can see is both for physical component and mental component, that patients with hypoparathyroidism in our phase 2 trial felt a little bit below average, as represented in the light gray. But by week 58, they were in the normal range in terms of how they felt physically and mentally. When you break it down into all the little components that make up the physical and mental the domains that make up the physical and mental components, these are things like down here, mental health, general health, bodily pain, physical functioning, vitality, all these things. Again, another radar plot. And in this case, you want to see the area grow bigger. At baseline, they had lower scores, but then by week 58, they're right here, sort of in the 50s, suggesting that they now have symptom burden and quality of life that matches the population norms. So really exciting. I'll show you this figure also from the paper that shows baseline, week 4 and week 26. The prior slide I showed you week 58. And again, what we'd like to see is that the gray the dark gray is bigger than the light gray. And what you see here is that indeed, for those who, even at week 4, for those who got TransCon PTH, they felt better quality of life. But those on placebo, these two colors are basically overlapping. Not much, clearly no better. And I will say this was also numerically, this was an important finding because it's something we call statistically significant in the science realm. And that means it's very likely to be a real finding, a reproducible finding. At week 26, again, everybody's on therapy. And what you can see is the dark gray area exceeds the light gray area. That's good news and is in the normal range for how people would feel. So this is my final slide. Thank you for your participation and active listening. Today we've discussed, right, an introduction to our company and how we do drug development with patients at the center here at Ascendis Pharma. And I was glad to share with you many of the work and contributions that this group has done, and including some of the results that we've been seeing from our phase 2 trial.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Amy, so much for that. We only had a couple questions, so we'll kind of roll through them. One of them, it says, can you attach PTH 1 through 84 with a linker and carrier just like you've done with PTH 1 through 34?
The question is, could we do the same thing with 1 to 84?
Yes.
Yes. In theory, we could. In this case, we haven't. We have always used the 1 to 34 throughout the development. And as I showed you, development takes quite many years. And it was a conscious decision to choose the 1 to 34 because it's recognized as the business end of the molecule. And it reacts on the receptors, reacts with the receptors in all the same way that the full length 1 to 84 would be that we know of now. And one interesting thing in drug development is that the smaller the molecule you need to give, the less volume of drug, right? So ultimately, when you think about what you have to inject into your skin, it's nicer to be able to use the smallest amount possible if you can. That was our approach.
Okay. And then it's asking about the study and the participants. Was it based on like a diversity with different races and nationality, or was it it was kind of along that line?
Okay, let me see if I can. Somebody asked about different races. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, great question. So the question was, do the participants contain different races and nationalities? Yes, the answer is yes. It was both trials recruited from North America and Europe with good numbers in both. And it's about a 2/3, 1/3 split, 2/3 North America, 1/3 Europe. And we are also planning trials in Greater Asia. So yes, we hope to be able to include a diversity of patients. And the manuscript that I showed you does include some of the race breakdown.
Okay. This one, this is from an anonymous attendee. It says, how does TransCon compare to NatPara or other RHPTH drugs being offered? From a patient perspective, this is a bit confusing.
Well, I'll give you the answer this way. So the question is, what's the difference between TransCon PTH and something like another recombinant parathyroid hormone, such as NatPara, PTH 1 to 84, or even some of these other recombinant PTHs that are currently used for osteoporosis. They are different, they're made up differently, right? So they're different molecules potentially in some cases, and they are designed to have different what we call pharmacokinetic profiles. And pharmacokinetics is a fancy way of saying how it is released into the body, right? So how, for instance, a practical way would be how much PTH is circulating in the bloodstream over a day, for instance, right? So the differences might be there in how much the drug is in the bloodstream, at what levels and for how long, and then there may be clinical outcomes that would differ or not. But to my knowledge, these drugs haven't necessarily been tested head to head, meaning in the, informally in a clinical trial. So beyond that is hard to say.
Okay. So this is from Amy Schweiger, and it's, what are the next steps in the testing and approval process?
So we have a timeline for the clinical trials, and that's usually something we predefine with the regulatory authorities, in this case, for instance, FDA and the European Medicines Agency, right? So we have defined how much data we would need to show them. And so when we reach that time, which is usually a time based on how, all the patients getting to a certain number of weeks of participation, then we will take a look at the data and put it together. Then we write it all up and put it in what's called an application to the regulatory authorities. And that can take several months to do. And then the regulatory authority, for instance, the FDA, takes several months to review it. And there can be back and forth during that time.
Okay, and this is the last one. It's from Alex Oxford. It's hypothetically, when could TransCon come to the market and what's realistic? Hypothetically.
Hypothetically. Yeah. And I certainly don't have a crystal ball, but I can, at this part, I can share, as the company has shared as well too. We are hoping to send in the package of information middle of next year.
Okay, I guess, and one more just came in, and it says, how do we as patients get involved in the FDA patient-centered initiative?
Oh, yeah, thank you for asking. And I would actually say, Amy, that you could ask your leadership and the membership of the Hypoparathyroidism Association. Oftentimes FDA will go to established patient groups such as yours, and they have before, right? Mm-hmm. To ask you, and then they host sometimes disease-specific listening sessions. And I think part of it is lobbying together as a group to say, hey, we would like to have you listen, right?
Yes.
So those are some of the ways. And then I think sometimes speaking with your physician, if they may have some avenues to get the attention. And then you can also certainly write to FDA and your senator, any of your government representatives too.
Okay, and then last thing it says this is from Barry, and she wanted to thank you for everything and appreciate you very much. And have you considered split dosing based on the needs of more PTH?
Okay. Hi, Barry. So I think you're maybe asking but let me know if I haven't interpreted your question right, is that for those who may be on bigger doses, does it make sense to dose it morning and night versus just one time a day? The way that we have designed our drug and the way that the patients have demonstrated in our clinical trials are that the PTH is continuously released for 60 hours. I think you heard that from Dr. Khan as well, to 60 hours after one single shot. So on purpose, we have stacked them a little bit so that if each one continues to release PTH for at least, actually the half-life is 60 hours. The released PTH half-life is 60 hours. So if you dose it then every 24 hours, we should be really in the clear, right? And that's what I showed with one of the first slides with the infusion-like lines there, is that I think if somebody wanted to dose twice a day, it would be fine. I'm not sure that one would feel any differently or that biochemical markers would be any different. And we did look at this. So I shared with you the healthy patient results, but some of the clinical trial subjects were kind enough to come in for observation for 24 hours for us to really show ourselves and FDA that the calcium in the blood and the urine stays stably handled throughout the 24 hours. And we will be looking at that data as it becomes available. So long way of saying, it was designed to be given once a day. All the data that we have so far suggests that once a day will be good and sufficient. but there's
Perfect.
nothing dangerous, nothing bad if you wanted to take it more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and I don't think anything else is coming
One
in.
more from Caroline. How do you manage physical activity, workouts, other changes in PTH needs with a single injection?
So I think this question is getting at, in case sometimes day-to-day life is variable and you might be asking more of your muscles and your nerves to do more things, how would a daily injection be handled? That is something we are looking to answer in some of the clinical trials, the ones that we're doing now, and potentially the clinical studies we'll be doing, in coming months and years as well too. We don't know the answer to that. It could potentially be different from having your own parathyroid glands functioning, or it could potentially be that once you have a certain amount, and it's sufficient, right? I think though, from what we've seen in the trials, potentially, say if one day you are extremely, say, sick, for instance, right? And those are the times sometimes when we know we need more calcium. Potentially someone would take an extra calcium. Whether you would take more drug, that remains to be studied and determined.
Well, I think that's it. And again, thank you and your team for putting this presentation together and answering some of these questions for us. I mean, I think it's really encouraging to see some of these things coming to fruition and seeing all the hard work that you guys have put in to make these things happen. So as far as everyone else goes, I guess we'll have a few minutes to take a break since we've been going for a couple hours, and we will see you here at 4:15.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for
Yeah,
the good
thanks.
questions.